Darren, we better turn around.
Why?
Because I've seen enough horror movies to know any weirdo wearing a mask is never friendly.
Horror films have a tendency to reflect upon themselves, to subvert or comment on their recurring elements. This is particularly true in the 90s with the wildly successful self-reflexive slasher film Scream, as well as films like I Know What You Did Last Summer, Urban Legend, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, and countless other postmodern horror films, which all make knowing winks at genre tropes and styles.
I'm the first to admit it. If this were a scary movie, I'd be the prime suspect.
But while Scream was able to utilize its self-awareness to make a statement about the pervasive cultural impact of slasher movies, these other self-aware films were rarely able to make such grand revelations, or any revelations at all besides horror movies are dumb. And in recent postmodern horror films since, where the sentiment has shifted from critique to celebration, the conclusion tends to be equally empty. Horror movies are awesome. It's rare to find a film that actually examines why we like being scared, or rather, why we need it. Bernard Rose's 1992 horror film Candyman is, like Scream and the others, self-reflexive, but rather than commenting on scary movies and their cultural effect, it instead meditates on the nature of fear itself and its inextricable link to storytelling, a lineage that extends long before cinema, before literature even, to man's oldest form of storytelling, oral folklore. When asked about his short story, The Forbidden, upon which Candyman is based, Clive Barker said, "I was writing about the experience of horror. This was about why we write these tales, why we hear these tales. This story was about itself." Candyman is, essentially, a story about stories. Right from its opening moments, the film announces its meta-narrative preoccupations, with the character telling the urban legend of Candyman.
It's the scariest story I've ever heard, and it's totally true.
And then, within her story, a character telling their own legend of Candyman.
Have you ever heard of Candyman?
No.
Storytelling, the act thereof, pervades nearly every element of the film. Our antagonist and titular character, Candyman, is a story himself, manifested in the physical form because enough people believe in him. Our protagonist, Helen, is a folklorist, a student of stories, of their evolution and development. And the primary form of storytelling that the film concerns itself with is the urban legend.
See, these stories are modern oral folklore.
In the book, The Vanishing Hitchhiker, Urban Legends and Their Meanings, author Jan Harold Brundtland defines the tradition as legends that, unlike fairy tales, are believed, or at least believable, and that, unlike myths, are set in the recent past and involve normal human beings rather than gods or demigods. Helen is studying urban legends for her thesis, which leads her to the story of Candyman, a famous urban legend within Chicago. Outside the film, the legend is entirely fictional. Not that any urban legend is definitively true, but Candyman is even less true, a fabrication solely for the film, whereas legends like sewer gators, true or not, actually do have recorded oral accounts. And the film draws from these pre-existing sources. The character seems to be an amalgamation of several different famous legends. His hook hand, similar to that of the escaped killer in The Hook, the repetition of his name in a mirror, similar to Bloody Mary.
Candyman.
Various other elements appear elsewhere in the film. The hair-turned-white trope.
What he saw turned his hair white from shock.
Come out of there, and his hair turned white.
The razor blades and candy trope are all derived from the iconography of these well-known folktales. But why urban legends? If the film is concerned with the nature of horror and fear, then why specifically legends and not, say, literature, or radio, theater, or cinema? There is one key element that separates oral folklore from these other mediums, and that is believability. As Brundtland explains in The Vanishing Hitchhiker, the stories are always presented as true, that they really occurred, and recently, and always to someone that is quite close to the narrator. For an urban legend to perpetuate, to live on, it needs to have credibility. We need to accept it as not only possible, but real, which is why, when told orally, either around the campfire or on the schoolyard, all these stories are prefaced with, "This happened to someone I know." Whether it be your friend, or your friend's sister, or your friend's sister's girlfriend's uncle's friend.
Why, once I met this guy, who knew 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 this guy.
Anything to lend your story validity. Believability is key here. And belief is a major theme running through the film. The same way Freddy Krueger needs people to be afraid of him, Candyman needs people to believe in him. Later in the film, when Helen is framed in a murder-kidnapping plot, she fails to make people believe in her own story, only this time, it's not a legend or tale, it's a testimony. Both Candyman and Helen represent groups who have been historically deprived of credibility, women and people of color. American society continually fails to believe their stories. Their allegations have gone unavenged, or their pleas of innocence have gone unheard. This is as true today as it was in 1992. Helen, even as a white, upper-class intellectual graduate student, still fails to generate credibility in the face of white male police officers, lawyers, doctors. Even her husband doesn't believe her. And this is actually quite common in the horror genre, in which a woman's sanity is constantly thrown into question for the audience and the other characters. In many horror films with female protagonists, there is always the looming possibility that it could all just be in their heads. Contrast this with films that feature male protagonists, where, even if the other characters don't believe their story, we as an audience almost always know they're telling the truth.
Now you have got to warn people.
You think this kid is drunk, Brent?
No way, you gotta listen to me. Jason's coming here, he's after me.
For whatever reason, male perception in horror is concrete, credible, while female perception is often dubious.
Look, there.
I see nothing, Elizabeth.
But Candyman is less concerned with gender than it is with race and class. Candyman was a former slave who ascended his racial and class-defined status by becoming an artist. After impregnating a white woman, he was lynched, punished for attempting to cross the racial class divide by ascending his social position. And this is mirrored in Helen's attempt to cross the same divide, albeit in the reverse direction, to descend her social position, naively venturing from her upper-class white sphere to the impoverished black sphere of Cabrini Green. Helen and Candyman both suffer for violating the rules of society, a theme we so often see in urban legends, where characters are routinely punished or killed for going places they shouldn't, doing disreputable things, or just not following the rules.
Now you gotta die. Those are the rules.
In the end of the film, Helen is killed, but returns as her own supernatural entity, enacting revenge on her husband who failed to believe her, and ensuring her own immortality as a legend. Real or not, she is immortal, given a life without living, as Clive Barker writes in The Forbidden, to be dead, but remembered everywhere, immortal in gossip and graffiti. And this seems to be the film's final comment on stories, that they are eternal, unlike even the humans who tell them. Individual stories may adapt and change over time, but still they persist. Folklorists speculate how the legend of the babysitter and the man upstairs may have originated in a real story of a babysitter killed on the job. After several mediums of removal, the device of the telephone was added, and eventually the ironic twist of the calls coming from upstairs. And even with those basic elements, we see endless variations. Do the kids live? The kids die? What does the man say on the phone? But the story endures. The legend of Candyman becomes the legend of Helen. We see this in the inexplicable change of graffiti at the end, and her legend may very well change in another 100 years. And the film, Candyman, represents the same process, an adaptation of a short story set in Liverpool, both stories carrying on the Gothic tradition, transforming the crumbling castles of the European countryside into the crumbling housing projects of urban society. And Candyman's sequels continued to retinker, adapt, and change. Its follow-up, Candyman Farewell to the Flesh, relocates to New Orleans and completely reworks his origin story. And a remake or spiritual sequel is on the horizon, updating, transforming, taking new shape, but all springing from the same source. Candyman occupies a unique space in horror, a film that is self-reflexive without being meta or snarky or winking. A film that poses, then aspires to answer the question, why horror? Why do we keep coming back to see or hear or experience fear? Is it for the thrill, the escapism of a good scare? Or is it the reflection of something revealed about our lives or society? Is horror then a doorway or a mirror? In Candyman, perhaps it's both. The mirrors are doorways, after all. Horror fulfills some kind of urge in all of us. To quote The Forbidden, perhaps there is a place, however small, reserved in every heart for the monstrous. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. This is actually my first video essay. It's something I've wanted to do for a really long time and just recently kind of forced myself to get around to. I'm hoping to do this with semi-regularity, so stay tuned if you're into stuff like this, mostly with a focus on horror and storytelling and things like that. If you agreed with or disagreed with or had something to say on anything discussed, please feel free to leave a comment. I would love to know your thoughts. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.